Hello, this is week 4 of the lecture on international trade, ECO735, the second semester. In this lecture, we will take a look at trade policy. The agenda shows an introduction into trade policy under perfect competition, and a long list of instruments that are used commonly in trade policy, like import tariffs, export tariffs, quantitative restrictions, like quotas, export subsidies, and of course, it's common to divide the instruments of trade policy into tariffs and non-tariff measures. We'll also take a look at the estimation of welfare effects of trade policy and close with the scope for further research. Trade policy consists of measures either to facilitate or to restrict trade. This is, I think, easy to understand because trade between countries is not something that happens overnight. You have to have a lot of infrastructure, you have to have transport, you have to have administrative infrastructure, you have to have banks to finance trade, you have to have a lot of preconditions for trade to happen. That is why there are important measures of trade policy that contribute to make trade possible, to facilitate trade. Of course, trade policy is also being used to protect the domestic economy, unfortunately, in many cases in such a way that it affects the welfare of a country in a very negative way. So that is why it's very important to understand what the impact of a tariff on welfare is and which groups of society are affected by tariffs. Consumers, producers, the government, and so on. Trade policy always has an impact on welfare and on resource allocation. We have learned that taking a look at the Ricardian model and the Heckscherlin-Samuelson model already. The instruments that we use in trade policy, they target either prices or quantities. The instruments that target prices are, for example, tariffs and subsidies, and those that target quantities or volumes or quotas, voluntary restraints, domestic content requirements, and so on. Of course, there is a relationship between both. If you target quantities, that may also have an impact on prices. Well, a tariff is a tax levied on imports. And tariffs can be of two kinds. We have ad valorem tariffs and specific tariffs. Ad valorem tariffs are defined as a percentage of the money value of imports. For example, 10% of the value of something that costs 100 rands, so it would be 10 rand, the ad valorem tariff. Specific tariff. Specific tariff is a lump sum tax per unit of the good imported, which is, of course, not something equivalent to an ad valorem tax. But we could have the same tax if, for example, we have a good that costs 100 rands and the specific tax is 10 rands, then we have the same case as an ad valorem tariff of 10%. So those are both kinds of tariffs that we find commonly around the world. What does a tariff do? Well, it alters the pattern of consumption, the pattern of production, and the pattern of trade. Why? What it does directly is it changes the domestic price of the imported good. Yes, the domestic price, this imported good becomes dearer, becomes more expensive because of the tariff. Yes, which is, of course, not very good for those who want to buy that good. A tariff also alters the welfare of a whole country and that of its trading partners. Yes, so if we levy a tariff in South Africa, this tariff has a welfare effect on South Africa and on all trading partners of South Africa that might have an interest in that good or in intermediate products that we need to produce that good. The tariff's impact on welfare, on the reallocation of resources, depends on the size of a country. That is why in economics we use two kind of models, basically the model of a small country that is a price taker and the model of a large country that has the possibility to influence world prices. The analysis of tariff effects on an economy takes place at 2 points in time. First, we take a look at the free trade equilibrium before introducing the tariff, and then we take a look at the new equilibrium that comes into being after the tariff has been introduced. I very much recommend that when you hear this lecture, take a look at this video, that you have the prescribed reading, which is chapter 5, trade policy of the book on applied international trade by Bohn, Hollander, and Vian. Yes, you should have this chapter with you because in the presentation I don't have the figures, and we will deal a lot with those figures. We will leave the formulas mostly for the book, but we will deal intensively with the geometrical representation of what we want to show. So we will stick to the standard textbook model of two countries, two production factors, and two goods. And we assume that the home country imposes a tariff tau, the Greek symbol tau, on imports of good 2. And we also assume that good 1 is being exported. So two goods, good 1 and good 2. Good 2 is tariff ridden and good 1 is exported. The domestic price PD and the world free trade price PW are the two prices that will accompany us through this discussion. We will always have, of course, the free trade price PW as a reference, and we will always deal also too with the domestic price PD. Ad valorem tariffs can be written mathematically in the way shown here. You have the domestic price equals 1 plus tau. This is the tariff written as point something. And 1 plus tau multiplies the international price. The specific tariff would be expressed by this formula. Here we have the domestic price is equal to the world price plus the lump sum tax or tariff, right? We'll now take a look at figure 5.1, which you find on page 137 of the prescribed reading. This figure, you find several curves in the plane Q1 and Q2. Q1 is on the vertical axis and Q2 on the horizontal axis. You find a concave transformation curve. You find a terms of trade line, which is lowercase f and higher case f as a tangent to the transformation curve at point capital A. Then you also find the trade line EE, small e, capital E. You find two utility curves, U1 and U2. You find the domestic price ratio line, CC, lowercase c, higher case c, and the new domestic price ratio line, lowercase d and higher case d. Now let us look at the initial free trade equilibrium, which we find at point A. At this point, the home country produces quantities of both goods, good 1 and good 2, and consumes at point B, yes, capital B, on the FF terms trade line with the utility curve U2 as a tangent. At point B, the country consumes much more of good 2 than at point A. Point A was the production point, and point B is the consumption point. The country exports the quantity AA, so lowercase a, higher case a, of good 1, and imports the quantity lowercase a, higher case b of good 2. After the introduction of the tariff tau, the domestic price increases, and the new relative price line is lowercase c, higher case c. Which means that the economy moves from higher case A to higher case A apostrophe as a new production point where we have more of good 2 and less of good 1 than in point A. Now the terms of trade line FF shifts in parallel towards the origin to the position EE, where the economy finds its new point of consumption at B apostrophe and at the lower utility curve U1. Here the economy imports the quantity BB apostrophe of good 2 and exports the quantity BA apostrophe of good 1. Thus, the tariff reduces the volume of trade and production in the whole country. The government, however, earns a revenue from the tariff which it may redistribute back to consumers. Let us now turn. What we just saw was a general equilibrium analysis of a tariff. Let us now turn to a partial equilibrium analysis of a tariff for the small country. And this you find on figure 5.2 on page 138 of the prescribed reading. Here we can analyze now the distributional effects of a tariff. To examine the distributional effects of a tariff, we take two panels in figure 5.2, panel A and panel B. The first panel, we see the domestic markets. It shows the plane PQ2 with the infinitely elastic foreign export supply line X2 star, which is horizontal, right? Then we also find the demand curve D2, which is negatively sloped, and the supply curve Q2, which is positively sloped. In panel B, which shows us the import market, we see the plane PM2 with import demand M2 and the foreign export supply line X2 star, which you already have in panel A2. Now the economy is at point lowercase b in panel A at its free trade equilibrium at the world price PW. Here domestic demand consists of domestic production QF and imports of DF minus QF. Again, so here domestic demand, DF, consists of domestic production QF and imports of good 2, DF minus QF. With the imposition of a tariff, the price PW increases to PD, and the foreign export supply line shifts upwards, where it crosses the demand curve at point A, which is the new equilibrium point after the introduction of the tariff. Domestic consumption moves from DF to DT, and domestic production expands from QF to QT, and imports fall from DF minus QF to DT minus QT. So what we see here is that the higher domestic price harms consumers. Everything gets more expensive. And this loss consists of an income transfer to producers and to the government, and an efficiency cost. We can see the area H and the area P on the curves. This represents the producer cost H and the consumer cost P. Switching to panel B shows the import market with a negatively sloped import demand curve M2 and the horizontal foreign export supply curve X2 star. The areas A and B in panel B, which are equal to capital I plus capital H plus capital P in panel A, show the loss in consumer surplus after the introduction of the tariff. Capital B, the area denoted capital B, is the net loss, excluding the income transfer to producers, which is capital C, the area denoted capital C in panel A. Now, summarizing, we have a loss of welfare in the small country if the small country introduces a tariff. The losses are borne by the consumer. And what happens here is that the consumer transfers parts of consumer income to producers and to the government. So this is what happens at the expense of consumers, favoring producers and the government. Now let us take a look at the large country. What happens in a large country that is able to influence world prices? And we also assume here that the foreign export supply is not inelastic anymore, it is elastic. We do that using figure 5.3, which you find at page 139. In this figure, we see the plane P times M2 and X2 star. So P is the relative price, and M2 is the import demand, and X2 star is the foreign export supply. With a positively sloped and elastic foreign export supply curve X2 star and the negatively sloped import demand curve M2. The initial free trade equilibrium in this figure 5.3 is at point A. After the introduction of the tariff, the domestic price increases as always from PW to PD, and imports fall, and the import demand schedule shifts towards the origin from M2 to M2T. The new tariff-ridden equilibrium is at point B, and the new lower world price is PWT now. Since the price has fallen, the value of imports decreases, and the import volume changes too, depending, of course, on the elasticity of the elastic curve of foreign supply X2 star. So the less elastic X2 star is, the larger will be the fall in price and the smaller the fall in volume of imports. and the opposite is valid too. The more elastic it is, yes, the larger, the lower will be the fall in price, and the larger will be the fall in volume of inputs. The net welfare change due to this tariff is capital C minus capital B. Those are the areas that you can see in figure 5.3. It consists of a loss in consumer surplus A, capital A plus capital B, tariff revenue to the government represented by areas capital A plus capital C, a loss in the surplus of foreign exporters due to the deterioration of their terms of trade represented in capital C plus capital D, and the gain of the importing country in terms of tariff revenue. C shows an improvement in terms of trade, area C. Thus, the total net change in welfare is shown in the areas capital A and capital C, income transfers within and between countries, and in areas capital B and capital D, which show a reduction in world welfare due to the tariff. The terms of trade gain of the importing country is equal to the terms of trade loss of the foreign country. What can the foreign country do in such a situation? Well, it could resort to a retaliatory tariff that would eliminate some or all of the importing country's terms or trade again. Yes, so it would eliminate some of or all of importing countries' terms of trade gain. However, such a measure could also reduce the trade volume further and therefore increase the welfare loss at the world level. I will now stop here, and the next slide will be discussed in the next video.